Hello everyone, my name is Raven, I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Rainbow Veteran. I hope everyone had a great holiday season and a happy new year as we go into 2025. Do want to apologize first and foremost for the gap in between the first episode and the second episode. With everything going on, I felt like I needed to get that first episode out there as soon as possible. So audio quality wasn't the greatest. And it was just trying to use these new microphones that I got. But I'm trying to get a little better, so hopefully now that I got some soundproofing stuff on the walls, it'll sound a bit better. But I wanted to talk about, for the second episode today, the history of the LGBTQIA plus community in the United States military. Now, not a lot of people know that there's actually a long history of those who served in the military, and a lot of those were part of the LGBT community, going all the way back to the Revolutionary War. Now, I do have a preface and a content warning slash trigger warning here. Well, I do go over the complete I'm not going over the complete history. I am going over a lot of the history of the LGBT community in the military for the United States. And so there's a lot of negative history there. There's a lot of bad history there. And I do know that a lot of people who are veterans that I interact with on my day to day life are those who have suffered from these negative eras in the military, and a lot of them are still alive. So I do want to put a big preface and trigger warning here. If this is something that you've experienced and is going to bring painful memories, by all means, please skip this episode. The next episode I'm going to be recording is going to be talking about the ABCs of the LGBTQIA plus community. And so I just kind of wanted to bring that up. I also want to add a little note. While I do use the full acronym LGBTQIA plus, sometimes we even use 2S LGBTQIA plus, just for sake of time, and I'm getting over a head cold, so my throat is still a little scratchy. I do want to kind of shorten the full acronym just to LGBT for sake of convenience, but when I say LGBT, I mean the LGBTQIA plus community. So first, I would like to say that I took a lot of this from multiple sites, history channels, like history.com. A lot of it is from Wikipedia, and a lot of historical accounts from places like StoryCorps, which talked about actual people talking about their experiences being LGBT in the United States military, especially around World War II, up until Don't Ask, Don't Tell's abolishment. With that being said, I want to go back to the Revolutionary Army. So, the first major influence in the United States military goes back to the actual Revolutionary War, with General von Steuben, who is one of the three authors of the Army's Blue Book. And I want to put this out as Army always, because I'm a Navy vet, Army always makes fun of us as being the queer, the gay, the gay branch of the military. I'm like, you guys do realize the guy who pretty much is the reason why you guys do a lot of the things in your training was made by a gay guy, right? So it just kind of it's a cool historical fact, and I really like it, but also, fuck you, Army. We beat your ass in the Army-Navy game, or Navy-Army game, whatever you want to call it. So, let's get started with von Steuben. He was born Frederick Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Baron, D. Steuben. He was born in Magdeburg, what is Prussia, which is now part of Germany, if you look at today's map, in 1730. Following his father's example, he joined the Prussian army at the age of 17. As a second lieutenant, Steuben took part of the 7-Year War, where he was wounded in the Battle of Prague. In 1759, he was promoted to first lieutenant and was wounded again at the Battle of Kunzerdorf. Now, I'm including a lot of the military history of von Steuben here, because I feel like it's a lot of context that needs to be added to kind of give a picture of why Washington wanted him to train his army. On June 26, 1761, he was transferred to General Headquarters, where he served as a staff officer in the position of deputy quartermaster. Later in 61, he was taken prisoner when Major General von Knobloch surrendered at Treptow on the Russian front. In 1762, he was released and promoted to captain, and eventually became an aide-de-camp to Frederick the Great. Then he joined the king's personal class on the art of war, where young officers were trained in complicated art of leadership. Shortly following the peace treaty, he was discharged from the Russian army on April 29th, 1763. So, a lot of the reason for his discharge is very unknown, but a lot of historians believe that this was due to his relationship with another man, or back then, the criminal act of sodomy. Many historians use writings where he wrote about an implacable enemy who led to his firing. This, along with records of Steuben having a relationship with one of his aides, William North, and potentially his other aide, Benjamin Walker, where he lived with both of them for 2 years and was very close to both men. It's a lot of, unfortunately, because how long ago it is, and how very little information there is about von Steuben's life. This is a lot of kind of, I guess, educated guessing, but a lot of the times we do that with a lot of historical figures, and a lot of them, for the most part, seem to be pretty right. We just don't have 100% proof that that he was gay, because unfortunately no one was going like, oh hey, I'm gay in the 1700s. On September 26, 1777, Baron von Steuben, his Italian greyhound Azur, Louis de Pontier, his aide-de-camp, and Pierre Entier de Duponqueux, his military secretary. Also, I do not speak a lick of French. I took 1 semester of it in middle school, and I sucked at French. So I totally am I'm gonna butcher a lot of these names. I do apologize. But they embarked for America to serve in the Revolution. They arrived in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on December 1st of 1777, where they were almost arrested for being British because the Baron had mistakenly outfitted them in red uniforms. Steuben and his party then traveled overland through Boston to York, Pennsylvania, where they arrived on the 5th of February, 1778. Then Baron met with Congress, where he presented them with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin. The letter introduced him as His Excellency Lieutenant General von Steuben, Apostle of Frederick the Great, but actually Steuben only achieves the rank of captain. Though the mistranslation of Steuben's position in the Prussian army, he was presented to Congress as a much higher rank. Steuben's title while in the Prussian army as staff officer was deputy to quartermaster general. In French, it was Lieutenant General Quarters Maître. So Franklin wrote Lieutenant General in his letter of introduction, which gave the impression that Steuben held a specific rank in the Prussian army. And a lot of this happened because of mistranslations, but it's nothing terrible. Even with the mistranslation, it just gave him a bump of 2 ranks, I believe, according to the Prussian army's ranking system. But even still, he was a mid-grade officer. Arrangements were made for Steuben to be paid following the successful completion of the war according to his contributions. Congress told Baron to report to General Washington at Valley Forge. And this was a huge thing, that Steuben's involvement with the Battle of Valley Forge actually kind of helped turn the tide of the war. He arrived at camp on February 23rd, 1778. One soldier's impression of the Baron was of the ancient fabled god of war. He seemed to be a perfect personification of Mars, which I believe, if I recall, that's the Roman version of Ares. The trappings of his horse, the enormous holsters of his pistol, his large size, and his strikingly martial aspect all seemed to favor the idea. And now, here's the thing I also think is interesting, because he was a soldier of the Prussian army, but also worked with Franklin the Great. I don't have any evidence of this is just pure speculation, but because he was one of the 3 writers for the Army's Blue Book, this is the reason why the Army uses bugle, I believe they're bugle, calls for certain faces, marches, raising the flag, lowering the flags. I believe this was because of von Steuben. I haven't looked this up entirely, but this is my educated guess. Steuben made a favorable enough impression upon Washington to be appointed temporary inspector general. He went out into camps, talked with other officers and men, inspected their huts, and scrutinized their equipment. What he found was an army short of basically everything, except spirit. He was quoted as saying, "No European army could have held together in such circumstances," and Steuben set out to work. His first step was to write drills for the army with the bugles. At this time, each state used different drills, maneuvers, patterns upon various European methods. As Inspector General, Steuben's task was to create one standard method, thus coordinating the entire Continental Army. As he could not speak or write English, Steuben originally wrote his drills in French, the military language in Europe at the time. The drills were then translated into English by his secretary, Dupontel, with the help from John Lawrence and Alexander Hamilton, 2 of Washington's aides-de-camp. They were given to the brigade inspectors, who made copies of the next lessons in the orderly book for each respective brigade and regiment. Copies were then taken to each company and then to each officer. The Baron used the commander-in-chief's personal guard unit and men from each state, about 120 men in total, as a model company to demonstrate each new lesson. Steuben would write the new drills at night, staying only several days ahead of the whole army. He tried to fit his drills to the men he was teaching in the quickest possible time by making them as simple as possible. In this way, uniform maneuvers and discipline was given to the army in a very rapid and orderly fashion. And this is a big part of what eventually becomes the Army's Blue Book. Up to this time, the American officers had accepted the British practice of letting sergeants drill the men, as it was thought to be ungentlemanly for officers to do. Steuben set a precedent by working with the troops directly. The American officers felt threatened by this practice, as well as by the seemingly unlimited power of Steuben's office. Consequently, on June 15, 1778, Washington issued orders to govern the Inspector General's office until Congress took further steps. The Baron's willingness and ability to work with men, as well as his use of profanity in several different languages, because this man swore with the best of them, made him popular among the soldiers. On May 6, 1778, the Continental Army showed off its newly acquired skills when they celebrated the news of the French alliance. Many soldiers, officers, and civilians noticed the marked improvement and increased professionalism demonstrated by the American troops. The same day, Steuben was handed his commission from the Continental Congress as Inspector General with the rank of Major General. Shortly after the Army left Valley Forge, they fought a battle at Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey. The battle was essentially a draw, but the Continental Army fought the British Army to a standstill, which was huge. Because up until then, it was pretty much lose, maybe kind of a win, but not a full win. So the fact that they were outnumbered, outgunned, and they were able to get to a standstill was a huge, huge bonus for the Continental Army. In the winter of 78 to the early months of 1779, General von Steuben went to Philadelphia to write his book of regulations. Lieutenant Colonel Francois de Fleury a French volunteer serving in the Continental Army, assisted in writing the original French text. Dupont and Captain Benjamin Walker translated it into English, and it was illustrated by Captain Pierre Charles L'Enfant, the man who would later design Washington, D.C. The regulation for order and discipline of troops of the United States was approved by Congress in March of 1779, and has become known as the Blue Book and was used by the United States Army until 1814. This original version had not changed for pretty much 40 years. 50 years. And that's how good it was. Now, it's evolved and is definitely different than the original version that Steuben worked on, but its essence is still in the United States Army's training manuals to this day. General von Steuben rejoined the Continental Army on April 27, 1779, and served throughout the remainder of the war. He was an instructor and supply officer for General Nathaniel Greene's Southern Army, which fought the key battles that led the British to surrender in Yorktown in 1781, which, fun fact, I recently visited my home area of Newport News, Virginia, and even there are placards and little, notes of von Steuben's work with the Congressional Army. And it's really cool to see. I have some pictures. I may put it up on my Instagram later. But yeah, it's really cool that, while I was writing this, I was also seeing the physical evidence and memorials of von Steuben. Steuben commanded one of 3 divisions in the Continental Army at Yorktown. In 1783, he helped demobilize the army and resigned his commission in 1784. Throughout the war, Steuben had continually asked Congress for more money for his expenses, and after the war, he continued petitioning for compensation of his services. Congress did pay a portion of the amount Steuben expected, but not all. He was also granted land by the states of New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, of which he sold portions, but these payments never quite offset his living expenses. Consequently, he was forced to retire from New York City to his land holdings in order to live out the remainder of his life. While Steuben never married, he did die on his 16,000-acre farm in Mohawk Valley of New York on November 28, 1794. Although he never received the financial rewards he expected, Steuben will never be forgotten in the annals of American history. His administrative brilliance in organizing, training, and preparing the Continental Army for battle will ensure his legacy in the cause for American independence. Despite rumors about his parties, there was never an official investigation of Steuben, and he received his congressional pension after the war. Now, this is huge because a lot of people believe that it's because of Franklin and Washington's writings to Congress that they basically kind of just ignored it and never officially investigated von Steuben for his affiliation sexually with other men. And it's a weird thing because it's also around this time we have the first evidence of being gay in the military was not okay. So the first evidence of antipathy to homosexuals serving in the United States military dates on March 11th, 1778, when Lieutenant Frederick Gotthold Ensslin was drummed out of the Continental Army following his conviction at a court-martial on the charges of sodomy and perjury. So even then, it was not really okay to be gay, but because of all that he could do and what he did do, von Steuben was kind of granted this weird exception to the rule. Fast forwarding to the Civil War, I want to talk about Albert Cashier. While there are many instances of women cross-dressing as men to fight in the Civil War, there are some who we would actually consider be trans men today. The prime example of this is Albert Cashier, who I'm not going to dead name. I'm not going to say their given name, but he was an Irish-born American citizen who fought for the Union. Cashier was very elderly and disoriented, possibly suffering from dementia, when interviewed about immigrating to the United States and enlisting in the Army, and has always been evasive about early life. Therefore, the available narratives are often contradictory. According to a later investigation by the administrative of his estate, Albert Cashier was born in Clogherhead, County Louth, Ireland on December 25th, 1843, to Sally and Patrick Hodgers. Typically, the youth's uncle or stepfather was said to have dressed his charge in male clothing in order to find work in an all-male shoe factory in Illinois. Even before the advent of the war, Hodgers had identified as Albert Cashier in order to live independently. Cashier's mother was known to have died prior to 1862, by which time her child had traveled as a stowaway to Belvedere, Illinois, and was working as a farmhand to a named man. was working as a farmhand to a man named Avery. Cashier first enlisted in July 1862 after President Lincoln's call for soldiers. As time passed, they needed soldiers for only increase. On August 6, 1862, the 18-year-old had enlisted in Illinois' 95th Infantry for a 3-year term using the name Albert D.J. Cashier and was assigned to Company G. The company descriptive book of the 95th showed the entry for Cashier, a 5'3" soldier, 19 years old, with blue eyes, auburn hair, and weighing around 110 pounds. Cashier easily passed the medical examination because it consisted of showing one's hands and feet. During the Civil War, many soldiers were young boys. Albert could not read or write, and instead marked an X on the enlistment papers. Cashier's fellow soldiers recalled that Cashier was reserved and preferred not to share a tent. Many soldiers from Belvedere participated in the Battle of Shiloh as members of the 15th Illinois Volunteers, where the Union had suffered heavy losses. Cashier took the train with others from Belvedere to Rockford in order to enlist, in answer to call for more soldiers. Along with others from Boone and McHenry counties, Cashier was trained to be an infantryman for the 95th Regiment at Camp Fuller in Rockford. After being shipped out by a steamer and rail to the Confederate strongholds in Columbus, Kentucky, and Jacksonville, Tennessee, the 95th was ordered to Grand Junction, where the regiment was part of the Army of Tennessee under the guidance of General Ulysses S. Grant. The regiment was part of the Army of Tennessee and fought in approximately 40 battles, including the Siege of Vicksburg. During the campaign, Cashier was captured while performing reconnaissance, but managed to escape to return to the regiment. In June of 1863, still during the siege, Cashier contracted chronic diarrhea and entered a military hospital, somehow managing to evade detection. In the second quarter of 1864, the regiment was also present at the Red River Campaign under General Nathaniel Banks, and in 1864, in June, at the Battle of Bryce's Crossroad in Guntown, Mississippi, where they again suffered heavy casualties. Now, during this whole time, Cashier is hiding his true identity, his identity of basically being a trans man. He's going around fighting with his federal Union soldiers, but evaded detection the entire time. In a way, this is kind of like the American version of Mulan. But instead of Mulan just using it as a disguise like many other Union fighting women at the time, Cashier's not a woman. Cashier's transgender. They just didn't have the language back then. Following a period to recuperate and regroup following the debacle at Bryce, the 95th, now a seasoned and battle-hardened regiment, saw additional action in late 1864 and early 1865 in the Franklin-Nashville campaign, at the battles of Spring Hill and Franklin, in the defense of Nashville, and the pursuit of General Hood. During the war, the regiment traveled a lot. They traveled about 9,000 miles. Other soldiers thought that Cashier was small and preferred to be alone, which were not uncommon characteristics for soldiers, especially those experiencing shell shock at the time, or PTSD. Cashier fought with the regiment throughout the war in over 40 battles until honorably discharged on August 17, 1865, when all the soldiers were mustered out. After the war, Cashier returned to Belvedere, Illinois for a time, working for Samuel Pepper, and continued to live as a man, settling in Sonneman, Illinois in 1869. And this is where the evidence of Cashier being a trans man comes in really, really huge, because most women who fought for the Union and somehow managed to not get it detected went back to live their lives as women. But Cashier never did. Cashier stayed with the man identity. Cashier worked as a farmhand as well as performing odd jobs around town and could be found in the town payroll records. Cashier lived with employer Joshua Chesbro and his family in exchange for work, and had also slept for a time in courting hardware store in exchange for labor. In 1885, the Chesbro family had a small house built for Cashier for over 40 years. Cashier lived in Sonneman and was a church janitor, cemetery worker, a street lamp lighter. Living as a man, Cashier was allowed to vote in elections and later claim a veteran's pension under the same name, which that payment system started in 1907. And I believe this is where an early recording of him later comes out. Because I keep seeing it on TikTok and everything, and it's a big reason why I put Cashier in this. Because, yes, there were some Civil War veterans who did talk, and I believe those recordings were in, I want to say, like, early 40s, late 50s. Like, there was a Civil War soldier who lived long enough to actually see the invention of the jet plane and actually touched one. There's a picture of him with his old Union uniform. But I believe it's in the early 20s or 30s when we actually get a video of Cashier talking about living his life as a man. In later years, Cashier ate with a neighboring Lannon family. The Lannons discovered their friend's sex when Cashier fell ill, but decided not to make it a public thing. In 1911, Cashier, who was working for State Senator Ira Lish, was hit by the senator's car, resulting in a broken leg. And a physician found out Cashier's secret in the hospital, but decided not to out them as well. So you got a lot of people just saying like, oh, yeah, that's a thing. Yeah, we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to keep that under wraps. So even then we had allies in the late 1800s to early 1900s. That's weird to talk about early 1900s because I was born in 95. Holy. No longer able to work, Cashier moved to the Soldiers and Sailors home in Quincy, Illinois on May 5th, 1911, where many friends and fellow soldiers from the 95th Regiment visited. Cashier lived there until an obvious deterioration of the mind began to take place and was subsequently moved to the Watertown State Hospital for the Insane in East Moline, Illinois in March 1914. Attendants at the Watertown State Hospital discovered Cashier's sex, at which Cashier was made to wear women's clothing again after presumably wearing men's clothes for more than 50 years. And in 1914, Cashier was investigated for fraud by the Veterans Pension Board. Former comrades confirmed that Cashier was in fact the person who had fought in the Civil War, and the board decided in February 1950 that payments should continue for life. Cashier died on October 10th, 1915, and was buried in uniform. The government supplied the typical small gravestone used to mark a veteran's resting place, which inscribed Albert D.J. Cashier, 95th Infantry. Cashier was given an official Grand Army of Republic funeral service and was buried with full military honors. It took W.J. Singleton, the executor of Cashier's estate, 9 years to track Cashier's identity back to the birth name. None of the would-be heirs provided convincing, and the estate of $282 after payment of funeral expenses was deposited in Adams County, Illinois' treasury. In 1977, local residents erected a large second headstone inscribing both names on the same plot at Sunny Slope Cemetery in Sonneman, Illinois. Cashier is listed on the internal wall of the Illinois Memorial at Vicksburg's National Military Park. So we had a trans man, took place in loads of battles for the Union, and was only discovered as being, and outed as being a trans man near the end of his life. And it wasn't uncommon. There's a lot of men who did that, a lot of trans men who did that. And I wanted to bring up Cashier because the whole fact of the Civil War narrative of women cross-dressing to fight for the Union is big, but stories like Cashier's do kind of get overshadowed and buried, and is an excuse to invalidate trans people being in our military for years. Now I'm going to flash forward to the 1910s to the 1940s. Before 1917, the U.S. military would discharge service members for homosexual acts, even in the absence of any explicit prohibition of sodomy or anal sex between men. However, this changed in 1917 thanks to the Articles of War of the United States, which was written in 1916, but it was implemented March 1st of 1917. In Article 93, it states that any person subject to military law, if you want to think about it, it's like a proto-UCMJ, who has committed assault with intent to commit sodomy, shall be punished as court-martial may direct. So that basically just kind of says, if you try to force yourself to commit sodomy, you will be court-martialed, which pretty sure sexual assault was kind of already a thing, but it was used in a big way to kind of justify kicking people out for having gay sex. And in 1920, this was actually modified to reflect that sodomy itself was the crime. And this is the first time explicitly there's an official ruling and this marks for the first time there's an explicit ruling prohibiting homosexual conduct. Despite the article, most branches had little to no policy on how to handle homosexual conduct and how to gauge it. Before 1949, each tended to charge personal Before 1949, each branch kind of tended to charge personnel caught engaging homosexual conduct, court-martialing them, and issuing a dishonorable discharge. However, in 1940, psychiatrists Henry Stack Sullivan and Winfred Overholzer formulated guidelines for psychiatric screenings for military inductees. Both believing homosexuals should not be inducted into the military, and neither proposed excluding all homosexuality from military service. Despite the recommendation, other psychiatrists and military officers made homosexuality a key component of screening apparatuses they recommended. The United States Army Surgeon General's Office issued a circular in 1941 that for the first time classified homosexual proclivities as disqualifying inductees from military service. The United States Navy and Selective Service adopted similar exclusionary policies. The Women's Army Corps, or WAC, adopted a similar policy in 1944. The Women's Army Corps issued harsh screening policies for recruits, often based on physical appearance and gender conformity, in order to exclude lesbians from service. WAC policies also condoned heterosexual relationships with servicemen in order to discharge homosexual conduct. It's at this point of confusion that I would like to interject here that with WAC and the eventual allowance of women in this service, that they were also charged with the act of sodomy. So in a way, it kind of became this stupid blanket crime for anyone who wasn't straight or conforming to the quote-unquote gender binary of the time. And I say quote-unquote gender binary because a lot of it was just gender expression, not gender identity. During the Second World War, with massive deployments of personnel, the court-martial method became a logistical nightmare for the military. Instead, the brass created a new method of discharge known as the blue ticket or a blue discharge. It was neither honorable nor an honorable discharge, and I guess in a way it's kind of more like other than honorable or a general discharge by today's standards. If you want to think about it that way, but the reenlistment, if you could get reenlisted, there was a specific discharge code with it. While the discharge was typically used to remove those conducting of homosexual conduct, it was also used as a weapon of racism that targeted African American service members. The blue ticket, by all means, not a good thing. It was so horrible because it followed you into your civilian life. As you returned, the blue mark basically told the VA or the Veterans Administration to deny you benefits, including GI Bills. It also followed people in their civilian careers, as many employers knew the connotations of the blue ticket would deny people employment. The blue ticket does get eventually replaced in May of 1947 to be general and undesirable, but these are heavily used for LGBT service members. The Army also changes regulation to ensure that homosexuals would not qualify for general discharges. Under this system, a service member found to be homosexual, but who had not committed any homosexual acts while in service received an undesirable discharge. And those found guilty of engaging homosexual acts were dishonorably discharged. Now, I'm going to keep going with this one, and I know this is a hard topic, but we're kind of entering the era of the full-on no gays in the military. Because we're going to the standard policy from 1949 to 1993 that eventually will be replaced by Clinton's don't ask, don't tell policy. So in October 1949, the newly consolidated Department of Defense standardized the anti-homosexual regulation across all branches of the military. Quote, homosexual personnel, irrespective of sex, should not be permitted to serve in any branch of the military in any capacity, and prompt separation of known homosexuals from the armed forces is mandatory. This is a thing that Truman pushed hard. And he did sign it as legislation on May 6, 1950, creating the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ, effective on May 31st, 1951. And it's really telling, because technically the language is still there in a lot of the articles. So it's a really big thing that I'm a little concerned about LGBT people going into service right now, especially with the current administration, because a lot of that was used as fuel during the first Trump administration for basically trying to kick out transgender personnel under the irrespective of sex part, because of sexual perverted, was it sexual proclivity or sexual perversion? One of the two. Now going back, the UCMJ established a single justice system for the armed forces, and in Article 125 forbids sodomy among all military personnel, defining an offender as any person subject to this chapter who engages in unnatural carnal copulation or sex with another person of the same or opposite gender, with any person of the same and opposite sex, or with an animal is guilty of sodomy. Penetration, however slight, is sufficient to complete the offense. So, so they're just lumping, you're gay or having anal sex, you're just as bad as bestiality. What the fuck? That does not make any fucking sense. But also, this is Truman and Eisenhower's eras of the fucking military, because Eisenhower also kind of said fuck you to the civilian side working in the government. This is because of the armed forces pre-screening self-identified gay and bisexual people from 1940 to 1981 remains in dispute. During the Vietnam era, some men pretended to be gay in order to avoid the draft. However, a significant number of gay and bisexual men did manage to pass through the screening process and served in the military with some special distinctions. And it's that point where I would like to point out that per capita, the LGBT community has a lot more service members than just the hetero cis community. And we don't try weaseling our way out of service. We try to serve. Even if we have to hide who we fucking are, we still believe in this country and trying to make it a better place. and we still serve for this country. But by the 1970s, a gay service member who had not committed any homosexual acts while in service generally received a general discharge, while those who have been found to have engaged often received an undesirable discharge. Gay service members receive disproportionate percentage of undesirable discharges issued. And in 1981, the Department of Defense issued a new regulation on homosexuality that was designed to ensure withstanding a court challenge by developing uniform and clearly defined regulations and justifications that made homosexual acts, whether self-applied or by the military, a conduct grounds for discharge. And if you want to look into that, there's a lot of legalese, but that's DOD Directive 1332.14, enlisted administrative separations, January 1981, because this is what I'll be quoting for a second. Homosexuality is incompatible with military service. The presence in military environment of personnel who engage in homosexual conduct or who, by their statements, demonstrate a propensity to engage in homosexual conduct seriously impairs the accomplishment of the military mission. The presence of such members adversely affects the ability of the armed forces to maintain discipline, good order, and morale, to foster mutual trust and confidence among service members, to ensure integrity that the system of rank and command, to facilitate, assign, and worldwide deployment of service members who frequently must live and work in close conditions, affording minimal privacy. To recruit and retain members of the armed forces, to maintain public acceptability of military service, and to prevent branches of security. This is also a big component of don't ask, don't tell, because if they found out this is the exact justification language that they used to kick people out of the military during the don't ask, don't tell era. And this directive justified and removed the Queen for a Day policy that promoted some courts to rule against the armed forces. However, the intent of the policy had also been to treat homosexuality as being akin to a disability discharge, thus ensure that anyone found engaging in homosexual activity or identifying as such would be separated with an honorable discharge. The DoD policy has since withstood court challenges, although the U.S. Supreme Court has refused to weigh in on the although the U.S. Supreme Court has refused to weigh in on how this affects the Constitution with the policy, preferring to allow lower courts the United States Congress to settle the matter. In the 1980s, many of the Democratic Party presidential candidates expressed an interest in changing the regulations concerning homosexuality in the armed forces, and as American social more changed, and as American social morals changed, public opinion began to express more sympathy with gay people in the armed forces, and at least to an extent that investigations into service members or women's sexual behavior or orientation were seen as a witch hunt. Quote, gays in the military became an issue in 1992 campaign where Clinton, the Democratic candidate at the time, promised to lift the military ban on homosexual and bisexual people. In 1992, the United States General Accounting Office published a report entitled Defense Force Management, DoD's Policy on Homosexuality, that outlined the DoD policy on homosexuality and the reasons for it. The report also included excerpts from previously unpublished 1988 Defense Personnel Security Research and Education Center study on homosexuality, as well as similar conclusions made in the 1957 Crittenden report. Now we're entering the don't ask, don't tell era from 1993 to 2011. And this was a big thing this was a big era that I grew up and saw firsthand. I grew up in Newport News, Virginia. I was a military brat. I'm like sixth generation military between both my mom, my stepdad, and my biological father. And I got to see a lot of it from the back end. Just didn't realize it at the time because of how young I was. And like I grew up in Newport News. Like I'm in the middle of Yorktown, Langley, Norfolk, Portsmouth. Like I'm near all those big military installations. Hell, we had Fort Monroe as an active military base. That was like a 20-minute drive for me at the time. And that was before they decommissioned her. So like I saw all this stuff, but it's like having to look back and trying to be like, oh, wait, hang on a second, and not realize what I was seeing was what I was seeing because, again, you're a stupid kid. You don't know stuff like that. So Don't Ask, Don't Tell, or DADT, was the term for the policy in the military from efforts to discover or reveal closeted gay, lesbian, and bisexual service members or applicants, while barring those who are openly gay, lesbian, or bisexual from military service. I would be lying to say that this didn't happen. The thought was if someone didn't ask and you didn't tell, those LGBT service members could continue to serve without any issues. Sadly, we know that wasn't the case, as others would out service members and they would get discharged. Sometimes it was just a phone call back home talking about your partner. Even just using gender-neutral pronouns, being like, oh yeah, my spouse, sometimes would get you investigated by some of your other service members. It's almost like if you want to think about the trans investigations nowadays, it was what people were doing in the military back in that era. Following the implementation of DADT, the Service Members Legal Defense Network was formed to protect the rights of active duty personnel, and other organizations, including Service Members United, which formed in 2005 by veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and groups associated with West Point and the Naval Academy. West Point's Nights Out and Naval Academy's USNA Out. Here I'm going to go into some like legal stuff to kind of try change it. So service members discharged under DADT continue to seek redress through the courts without success. Court's office cited the Supreme Court decision in '86 with Bowers versus Hardwick, which upheld the constitutional state of sodomy laws. After the Supreme Court reversed Bowers in Lawrence v. Texas in '03, the Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces ruled that Lawrence v. Texas decision applies to Article 125, however, of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which banned all acts of sodomy. So, United States v. Steyerwald and United States v. Markham, the court found Article 125 constitutional, but ruled that the conduct fails within the liberty interested and identified by the Supreme Court. But also stated that despite the application of Lawrence to the military, Article 125 could still be upheld in cases where there, quote, factors unique to the military environment that would place the conduct outside of any protected liberties in interest of recognition of Lawrence. So basically, the Supreme Court said, yeah, the UCMJ, it's fine, it's constitutional, it's its own thing because we have this weird thing with the military where there's specific things we have to do for the military, specific ways to make sure the military is doing what they're doing. So we're going to say it's constitutional because you can't have the same liberties as a civilian while you're in the military. Isn't that so fucked up? Convictions for consensual sodomy had been overturned in military courts under Lawrence in United States v. Meno and United States v. Bullock. In the course of reviewing an end of DADT, the Department of Defense Comprehensive Review Work Group recommended repealing or amending Article 125 to eliminate any ban on consensual sodomy between adults. And this is where it kind of becomes a big issue to the thing is here is what I'm going to talk about in a minute is the fact that even today, we still have a lot of things screwed up from Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There's a lot of people who were outed and were forced to take a court-martial. But because they took a court-martial thinking it would be better for them because they were misinformed or lied to, they can't get the benefits returned to them that the Biden administration excused or made into law because they don't have a discharge based on homosexual conduct or anything like that. They have a court-martial discharge, which just shows up as you broke the law, you fucked up, here you go. So, if I recall correctly, Biden did pardon a lot of people in the middle of last year, like May, June, and a lot of that was because of those discharges, because of the court-martialing based on, quote, homosexual conduct. But even still today, there are people who are still being screwed over from the Don't Ask, Don't Tell era. So what kind of created the downfall of DADT? It was a lot of court legal challenges, including Witt versus the Department of the Air Force and Log Cabin Republicans of the United States. The first ended in a negotiated settlement, but only after the lesbian plaintiff, whom the Air Force tried to discharge, won retirement with full benefits in 2011, as DADT neared its end of its life. The second, a federal judge, Virginia A. Phillips, ordered the military on October 12, 2010 to suspend and discontinue any investigation or discharge, separation, or other proceedings that began under DADT. A series of appeals and stays of her order followed in the fall of 2010, just as congressional attempts to repeal DADT took shape. The first one began in May of 2010 when the House approved an amendment to the 2011 NDAA, or National Defense Authorization Act. It failed in September when Senator John McCain led a successful filibuster against it, which sucked because he was a vet, and it kind of sucks that him being like, oh, well, I don't believe in homosexuals, so fuck them. In December 2010, after a second Senate filibuster, Senators Joe Lieberman and Susan Collins introduced the Don't Ask, Don't Tell Repeal Act of 2010. And this was happening when I'm in high school. Like, I'm in 10th grade at this point and just came out to my friend group. So, like, this was big news for me. And I remember sitting and watching C-SPAN. This is when I first started really watching C-SPAN because I wanted to go into the military. I wanted to go in the military ever since I was a little kid. And I paid close attention to this kind of stuff because it was going to affect how I was going to act. Because up until this point, up until these kind of things, I knew I was going to have to hide a big part of myself that I had just kind of, sort of discovered at that time. But it did pass the House on December 15th, and then the Senate on December 18th, and President Barack Obama signed the bill on December 22nd. On the December 29th, 2010, the Department of Justice asks the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to suspend proceedings in the log cabin case. Instead, on June 6, 2011, that court, citing progress made by military officials in preparing for an end of DADT, ordered the government to cease enforcement while dismantling the policy. Repeals were not immediate. The Department of Defense first reviewed its policies and guidelines. The Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff certified that the new regulations had been drafted, and the new regulations would not damage military cohesion and readiness. That certification triggered a 60-day wait period, at the end of which, on September 20th, 2011, Don't Ask, Don't Tell expired. And in 2 or 3 months after that, I was talking to recruiters. Because that was September 2011, that was the start of my junior year. So I was looking at military branches. And then by, I want to say September 2012, my senior year, that's when I seriously started talking and looking at recruiting. And I think I signed up for, like, DEPS, for a delayed enlistment program. I want to say I signed up for DEPS in, like, it was cold and snowing outside. I remember that. So I signed up, and I want to say, like, December of 2012 is when I signed up for DEPS. So, like, the moment this came out and talked about, like, oh, you don't have to hide who you are, I'm like, cool, because I identified at the time as bisexual, so if I ended up falling in love with a man and getting a husband, I wouldn't have to hide him. I wouldn't have to stuff him in the closet or anything, or just say, oh no, he's my friend who lives in Tucson or something like that. I do want to bring up a little tidbit about the service academies. A research report that appeared in the Journal of Armed Forces and Society at the end of 2011 said that the military academy cadets opposed allowing homosexuals to openly serve in a greater percentage than participants in ROTC did. Fun fact. And that both groups opposed such service to a greater degree than their civilian counterparts. Some news outlets viewed this as a negative reaction to the repeal of DADT earlier in the year, but authors of the study said it drew on survey data collected between 2002 and 2007 and believed that the research provided no information about the opinions following the end of DADT. They wrote that the strong disagreements of the anti-gay sentiment found among entering cadets declined somewhat during their time at the service academy. Surprisingly, military culture appears to have made cadets more tolerant of gays and lesbians, not less. This is because sometimes, not all the time, because some people go back to their hometowns and get rewired and reintroduced to hate. When you serve, there's no such thing as race. There's no such thing as creed or, religion or ethnic background, homosexuality. You're just another soldier or sailor, airman or marine, serving with your other soldier, sailor, airman or marine. Now, there are things that you can do, like the religious services you can practice. You still practice your faith, talk to certain chaplains of your faith, so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, you are just another... My parents were Army, like my dad was Army in the Navy, and my mom was Army, so you're just another man in the foxhole, another woman in the foxhole, another person in the fucking foxhole, in the trenches, standing side by side with your other service members. And that's the thing a lot of people don't understand, and it kind of hurts when I see veterans go back to their hometown and kind of relearn their hate. And I gotta say, it affected me too when I came back home, because I was such a douche when I came back home. Not as bad. I didn't do super racist things or sexist things, but I will admit I was that asshole. Like, I got fucking friend zoned. Like that toxic masculinity got rewired into me when I got home. And if it wasn't for a Marine veteran calling me out on my shit and basically just kicking me in the ass to kind of get me back out of that, I might have been a little bit more of an asshole for a bit. After Don't Ask, Don't Tell, ending issues still prevailed for same-sex or same-gendered couples. They were not treated like their heterosexual counterparts. This is mostly due to Section 3 of the Defense of Marriage Act, or DOMA. And certain federal statutes contain definitions of marriage that exclude same-sex couples, same-sex spouses, and death benefits, identification cards, base access, and access to reparation ceremonies and other entitlements. So basically, you could be gay, but because of DOMA, you weren't given the same benefits as your heterosexual counterparts, which was fucking stupid. So you couldn't live on base together. You couldn't go on base to go to the commissary together. You couldn't, it was really fucking stupid. And thankfully, when DOMA ended, a lot of those things were removed. In December 2012, the Association of Bragg Officer Spouses, or ABOS, denied membership to Ashley Broadway, the female spouse of a female Army officer. During the weeks of press coverage that ensued, Fort Bragg's commander said he lacked authority over the private organization, while U.S. Marines announced the club's conducting business on base must admit same-sex spouses. ABOS offered Broadway a, quote, special guest membership, which she declined. And on January 26, Military Spouse Magazine named Broadway Fort Bragg's 2013 Military Spouse of the Year. That same day, ABOS officially invited Broadway to join and announced that membership was open to any spouse of any active duty commissioned or warrant officer with a valid marriage certificate from any state or district in the United States, which is still a cop-out, but that was before the federal recognition of marriages went across. So, I mean, it was a little way in, but still being a cop-out. February 11th, 2013, the Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, announced the department's extension of certain military, quote, additional benefits to same-sex spouses which are not explicitly prohibited under the Defense of Marriage Act. In addition, these member-designated benefits which were already available to same-sex spouses. In June of 2013, when that was like, I think this was like right before I shipped out the basic. The Pentagon announced plans to begin issuing identification cards to same-sex partners of service members, which will allow them to access education, survivor, commissary, travel, counseling, and transportation benefits, but not health care or housing allowances. Discharge pay was also an issue for many of those discharged for homosexuality, who received only half the separation pay upon discharge. All were discharged under the DADT policy, but the ACLU said that the practice antedated the adoption of DADT. On January 7th, 2013, the ACLU reached a settlement with the federal government in Collinsville, United States, that provided for the payment of full separation pay for service members under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell era since November 10th, 2004. Some 181 were expected to receive $13,000 each. There was also less than honorable discharges. Following the end of DADT, approximately 114,000 service members who had been separated from the military since the Second World War under the category of other than honorable, general, or dishonorable discharge became eligible for their discharges to be amended. Those without an honorable discharge are often excluded from veteran benefits like healthcare, tuition assistance, and a lack of honorable discharges can create a hurdle for employment in the civilian sector as well. Now, I will say this recently changed as well. Kind of fast forwarding a bit, where a lot of the benefits to things used to have like a 2-year service requirement, or you had to have honorable. A lot of those things kind of opened up to even like those who were medically separated and basic. Were allowed to get these kind of benefits, especially with healthcare and mental health care. Let's see. In June 2013, after advocates for gay and lesbian veterans complained about the process, Representative Mark Buchan, Democrat of Wisconsin, and Charles Rangel, Democrat of New York, introduced the Restore Honor to Service Members Act in the House of Representatives to codify the process and reintroduce reduce inconsistencies. Now, this may be a fuller episode down the road, but I do want to talk about LGBT in the VA. So, following the end of DADT, a lot of the VA kind of took everything that happened and started changing things for service members. And this was their response. They wanted to alleviate the concerns from the gay and lesbian veterans about discrimination and address the healthcare disparities. In 2013, the Veteran Health Administration had introduced some policies. For instance, the VHA had established the Office of Health Equity to oversee gay and lesbians' healthcare needs and reduce the inequalities in their healthcare provisions. The new development marked a milestone in expanding the role of the government in improving healthcare provisions for gay and lesbian veterans. The VHA instituted policies that focused on individualized care. They required healthcare providers to care for gay and lesbian patients in the same respectful and sensitive manner as other patients. Other policies were announced to redefine the meaning of family and allow gay and lesbian veterans to decide who is regarded as part of their family. In 2014, there were many discrepancies regarding the information, and the information found on medical records is often inaccurate and may not be clearly indicated the choice of the veterans. The VHA also launched educational and training programs so that healthcare providers will have a better understanding of psychological and social distress of gay and lesbian veterans. Which, fun fact, this whole thing, and eventually becomes Pride in All Who Serve, was started. This is kind of like the tail end of it, and actually where it's getting fully implemented and everything. Was started in Hampton, Virginia, with the Hampton VA. And I just gotta say, as someone who grew up in that area, fucking hoo-yah on that. When I was part in Pride and All Who Serve training with the VA and that course, that was a big thing that I got really happy with and was like, yes, yes, let's fucking go. Um, and so like it's a lot of things that healthcare eventually gets brought in for like trans people, and trans people can get their healthcare. And I like me, I can get my HRT, which I'm trying to do with the VA now. Because my rating's high enough, I don't have to go to the doctors and pay money for blood work. Um, and even now, like last year in March, they introduced an IVF treatment plan for individuals or same-sex couples within and out of the military. Um, and so it's really great that we're actually going forward and changing. So, like, I want to say that the history for the LGBTQIA plus community with the military has been one of a lot of ups and downs. And it is slowly getting better, but we cannot let this incoming administration bring us back. We can't go back to where we were treating anyone who wasn't cis or straight as an enemy, and has to be basically kicked out of the military. In my opinion, that anyone who decides to raise their right hand and swear an oath to the Constitution, as long as they're medically fit to do so, should be allowed to serve. And if anyone tells me, oh, HRT is a reason to disqualify someone, I would like to remind people that there are service members who are on ADHD medication now, serving. There are people who have suffered PTSD and are still serving the end of their contracts, who are receiving medication. So I don't want to hear the argument that HRT is an issue, especially when we spent millions of dollars on Viagra for service members. So in my closing notes for this episode, I just kind of want to reiterate that we cannot go back with this current administration. We cannot let Trump's administration return us to the don't ask, don't tell era, or even just pushing back on trans service members serving in the military. While there's a lot of news articles going around a month or so ago about his plan, a lot of it was just reminding people of what he tried to do the first administration and horribly failed, which is why I didn't put it in this episode, because nothing came out to legality. And I talked about it quite a bit on the first episode. So with that, I have nothing else to add. I would like to remind everybody to stay safe, stay vigilant, stay hydrated.